Hey listeners, it's Lindsay Smith Rogers with some exciting news and an ask for you. Public Health on Call is coming up on 1,000 episodes, and we want to hear from you. To mark this milestone, Josh Sharfstein, Stephanie Desmond, and I are answering your questions about the show. Have you ever wanted to know how we pick topics or how we prepare for interviews? Now's your opportunity to ask your question and hear your voice on the podcast. Send us your question as a voice memo to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu by October 31st. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu by October 31st. Thank you so much, and we are so excited to hear from you.
Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
Hey listeners, it's Lindsay Smith Rogers. Today, an update on Baltimore's quest for a cleaner harbor. Last year on the podcast, we did a deep dive on the nearly 15-year-long effort to make Baltimore's harbor healthier for both ecology and recreation. But over the summer and into the fall, a series of events like fish kills and what's known locally as Pistachio tide felt like major setbacks. In today's episode, I speak with Baltimore Banner reporter Adam Willis, who has been following the Healthy Harbor Initiative, about where we are now and the bigger question of where we can go from here. Let's listen. Adam Willis, thanks for joining us on Public Health on Call. How are you?
I'm good. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Would you give us a little bit of background about you and your work?
Sure. So I am the environment and climate reporter for the Baltimore Banner. That means that I cover all things water issues, as well as the changing climate, the changing Chesapeake Bay, and Maryland, and also here in Baltimore. And my newsroom actually is right in the heart of the Baltimore Harbor. So I've been keeping close eyes, just literally from my desk, on events in the Baltimore Harbor over the last couple of weeks.
And we're going to talk about what those events are. But first, a year ago, this podcast released a special episode where we looked at this enormous initiative that has spanned more than a decade for Baltimore to clean up its inner harbor. Can you just give us a little bit of background on that?
Sure. So it goes back around 2010-ish, this effort to make a swimmable harbor, which has gotten a lot of attention in recent years. But there's a guy named Mike Hankin with the group Waterfront Partnership in Baltimore, which is sort of a downtown booster group. And he took the initiative 15 years ago or so to set a goal to make a swimmable harbor in Baltimore. This is something that seemed laughable to a lot of people not that long ago. And now we actually have organized swim events in the harbor in the summer, to some controversy, but we do have those events. So the efforts for a swimmable harbor originate around 10 to 15 years ago. I guess I should say, stepping back from that, though, the efforts to clean up the harbor go back further. And the city has struggled for decades now with both urban runoff as well as sewage overflows into the harbor. We have a very old sewage system, and the city has been under a consent decree for 20 plus years now to reform its sewage system and to stop basically having sewage overflows that go literally into the Baltimore Harbor. So we're dealing with a lot of long-standing issues here that make both a safe body of water for humans, but also a safe body of water for the ecology of the Chesapeake Bay quite challenging.
Yeah, and I don't know if you lived here 10, 15 years ago, but I did. And the thought of swimming in the harbor is unthinkable at that time. I mean, the harbor smelled, it looked bad. There was trash everywhere. When you say laughable idea, it really was. But then part of the Healthy Harbors Initiative is that they've been doing these readouts frequently. There's this readout called the Healthy Harbor Report Card, and they look at a number of different factors. So can you talk a little bit about that report card?
Sure. So like you said, there's an assessment basically that comes out every year that, as it sounds, that looks at the health of the harbor. There's sort of an interesting inside baseball thing going on here where they're both measuring the health of the harbor for its ecology, for fish and for crabs and for underwater plant life. And they're also measuring its health for humans, which turn out to be very different questions. And The group Waterfront Partnership, I think very openly sees itself as a promoter of a recreational harbor. This idea that if we had a clean harbor that was safe for people to swim in, to kayak in, it would be this amazing asset for Baltimore and for the city. So they release this report card every year, basically as a benchmark of the progress that we're making towards that end goal. Adam Lindquist, the vice president of Waterfront Partnership, put it this way last week, but we've seen these steady gains, as you talked about, in the safety of specifically localized parts of the harbor for human recreation, for swimming. The ecology stuff turns out to be a lot harder and more stubborn. So this report that came out last week does point to some strides that we've made incrementally over the years in finding or achieving a safer, cleaner harbor for swimming. Safety for the ecology has been, I think, slower coming.
Yeah, one of the things they talk about is that there are things in the water that are harmful to humans, like bacteria. You talk about sewage. They are not so harmful, actually, to the creatures that are naturally, from that area. However, there are things that are very harmful to them, like dissolved oxygen levels, that don't bother humans.
Yeah, for sure. So we have these kinds of, I wouldn't say competing ideas. I think they kind of go hand in hand, but we have these two very different metrics. And I think it makes it like the conversation about what is the status of the harbor a little bit trickier in terms of the public messaging, because the question of is it safe for me to jump in the harbor on a random Thursday afternoon is very different from why aren't there more fish in the harbor on that same afternoon?
Yeah, and I think it's also important to note here that this initiative to clean up the harbor has been enormously collaborative across the city. It has involved groups like the Waterfront Partnership. It has involved universities, institutions, the Department of Public Works. Can you just talk a little bit about some of the factors that have gone into, quote unquote, cleaning up the harbor or improving this report card overall?
A big one, I think it's probably safe to say the biggest one is these issues around sewage overflows and sewage pollution. I mean, it's as gross as it sounds, and the city has legitimately made a lot of progress on that front. There's still sewage that on days with heavy rain will literally flow into the harbor, but we've reduced that problem pretty significantly. There's a story that I did a couple of weeks ago. The city basically has an estimate for how much money it's going to take to cover the rest of that problem. But they say that by the end of the decade, they're going to be at, I think, 94% reduction in sewage overflows. People will sort of quibble with that statistic and stuff. But the point is there has been a lot of progress made on that front. And that reduces nutrient pollution dramatically, and it reduces bacterial pollution, which is what's harmful to human health, really dramatically. But there's also, another big challenge for any urban waterway is runoff. It's a concrete jungle essentially downtown and then even across the rest of the city. So every time it rains, you have runoff that comes from the sides of streets with animal waste, with trash, with all sorts of things that flow into these spillways that go down to the harbor and just empty out there. We've made progress on that front too, I think, but it's hard and it's sort of an intractable problem in a city where so much of the land is just paved over and we have all these buildings and you can put in trees, you can put in rain gardens and things like that to soak up pollution, but that problem isn't really going to go away.
That kind of brings us to where we are today. There was recently a Healthy Harbor report card readout. You and I were both at that event. The vibe was much different, and part of that had to do with literally the smell in the air. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so it was a really fascinating event and a pretty discordant one because, like I was saying, this Healthy Harbor initiative, a lot of their reason for being is to promote a safe harbor and a swimmable harbor. It's tough to gather that crowd into a room along the waterfront in Fells Point in Baltimore, and you look outside the windows and the water is literally a milky pistachio green. And if you step outside, it reeks. It smells like, people say, rotten eggs. I said in a story, it smells like the inside of a porta potty. It was pungent and unavoidable to the point where neighborhoods of Baltimore, people were experiencing it in their living rooms. It was permeating people's homes. So we had this event happening around a really severe ecological event that was happening in the harbor. It's known locally, and as far as I know, only locally, as a pistachio tide. this event where, because of this sulfur bacteria basically that exists on the bottom of the harbor, that because of weather patterns came up to the top, turned the water green, it turned the harbor this terrible smell. And all of this was going on and had actually been going on for, I think, for weeks, basically, at the point of this event, as Waterfront Partnership and all of these advocates for a cleaner harbor were gathering to celebrate the progress that the harbor has made, which, again, is a discordant feeling.
And my understanding is that a pistachio tide, this is something that happens from time to time, even in a totally healthy ecological system. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, the experts that I've talked to have had interesting perspectives on this question because it is a natural phenomenon on some level. It's caused by, people call it a turnover event. So basically, when you have cool weather comes in after it's been warmer, so often at the end of the summer or start of the fall, you can have these events where the cool water at the top becomes denser, sinks to the bottom, and brings up these oxygen-deprived waters from the bottom of the harbor, where there's also sulfur bacteria and all of this bad stuff. It's a natural phenomenon that doesn't just happen in the Baltimore Harbor. It happens elsewhere in the Chesapeake Bay. It happens in pretty much any, can be very severe, I guess, in more stagnant bodies of water. But anywhere where you have that kind of body of water, these turnover events can happen. The issue that I think makes it a little bit trickier is just that it is made worse by all of these pollution issues that we were just talking about. The fact that we have all of this sulfur bacteria at the bottom and an oxygen, essentially dead zone at the bottom, is a sort of systemic result of decades and decades of pollution challenges in the harbor. So all of that mixes together for a naturally triggered event, but one that's made worse by the fact that humans and cities pollute water.
And my understanding is that it's not necessarily harmful to humans, though it is not an appetizing situation, but it is extremely harmful to wildlife.
Yeah, and I think that's like part of what makes it difficult to talk about when we're balancing these like ecological or these wildlife and these human swimming kinds of concerns. Because as far as I understand, if someone had walked out of that event and stepped into the harbor and went for a swim, it would have been basically fine. But it's devastating for the wildlife in the water to the point where it's sort of a dramatic image. But I was talking to Adam Lindquist, the vice president there after the event. He was saying, I believe they had like drone shots of this, that wildlife either was dead or it had fled the harbor because the harbor was just essentially deprived almost completely of oxygen. So he was describing a drone shot of fish fleeing out tributary of the harbor, swimming out in search of oxygen, basically. So there you have this result where there's so little oxygen in the body that everything that is there dies. There's like a mass exodus basically at once. And then you have a body of water where there essentially is no, more or less, there's no life to speak of in the water.
Mhm. Your coverage of this, I think, has done a good job of balancing the optimism that people feel like we really have come so far in cleaning up the harbor, and it has been this massive effort. But at the end of the day, it is still an inner harbor of an urban area. It is still a man-made thing dredged out of a natural body of water. And I think it begs the question of like, just how far can we go? What is a more reasonable expectation for looking at the overall health of the harbor?
That's kind of the big question that I'm trying to answer right now. I'm working on a story about potential solutions to this problem. So on top of this extensive pistachio tide, we had several really bad fish kills in the last month and a half, 2 months. I think there were 3 really significant ones, but 2 in August that resulted in like 180 something thousand dead fish. And then another in September, about a month later, that was like 25-ish thousand dead fish. But these are things that are impossible to miss if you're a resident of Baltimore and you come down to the harbor. The pistachio tide and thousands of dead fish floating on the surface really drive the point home of how much of a challenge this is. So I think there's a lot of, because of this series of events we've experienced in the last 6 to 8 weeks, there's a lot of interest and thought going into ways that we could prevent these kinds of issues in the future. And I had an interesting conversation with Eric Schott, a harbor environmental scientist, Adam Lindquist, and others at Waterfront Partnership after that harbor report came out recently. As far as they're concerned, it's still an open question. There was a lot of conversation around, are there ways to inject more oxygen into the harbor? Are there ways to re-engineer the shoreline so it's not these kinds of boxed-in, impermeable walls that would be more natural shorelines? That's a really big ask in an urban waterfront, though. There's an interesting idea that Eric Schott has brought up to me a few times, but even he seems to be uncertain of how much of a difference it would make. Could we make the harbor shallower in places that the depth somehow exacerbates how dramatic these turnover events are? And if you had a shallower harbor, you might be able to mitigate some of this issue. So sort of a long-winded way of saying there's a lot of concern about this right now and a lot of thought going into, are there ways to environmentally rejigger the harbor to address these problems? But I don't think anyone really knows at this point how realistic that actually is. I don't think anyone thinks that we're going to go back to some sort of utopian, pre-industrialized Baltimore harbor, natural shorelines and wetlands all over the place. So I think the question then becomes, how can you replicate parts of what the harbor once looked like before we had industrialized and built up a whole city around it to try to address some of these issues? One other thing I would say really quickly is that the other challenge that they're running into, I think, in trying to think this through is that it's not totally clear how unique Baltimore is in this case. Even the name Pistachio Tide, again, as far as I'm aware, is only used in Baltimore. And I think that's presented a real difficulty in even Googling for other places that are experiencing the same kinds of events. We know about turnover events elsewhere, but this kind of dramatic pistachio tide that we are experiencing in Baltimore, it seems to be an open question from the people that I've talked to of just how unique are we in this problem? And that makes it a lot harder to address if you don't know which other cities to look at as models for fixing the problem.
As we're talking right now, you are in your office down by the harbor. The smell is much better. We've had some significant rain this week. How are things looking where you are right now?
Yeah, I haven't had any conversations in the last 48 hours to confirm the science on this, so I don't want to speak too authoritatively, but just from walking across the bridge from the parking deck into my office this morning, it's a different world in the Baltimore Harbor this week. The water is back to sort of a murky brown, which turns out to be a lot more comforting than whatever sort of emerald color it was last week. And it doesn't smell bad. So it seems like that pistachio tide has basically abated, as far as I can tell, in the last week. Adam Lindquist at the Healthy Harbor event, I think, put it really well when he said the harbor just had a heart attack, essentially. This event was the ecological equivalent of a heart attack, and it needs I can't say the word, defibrillator. He predicted that might come in the form of like a strong rain, which we did experience this weekend, which seems to have injected some dissolved oxygen back into the harbor and brought things back to stasis.
Well, Adam Willis, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you about this. Obviously, this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. We've been following it here on Public Health on Call, and I really look forward to hopefully following up with you on the continued work that you're doing.
Yeah, this was fun. Thanks for having me.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith Rogers, and Stephanie Desmond. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Michael Bonfils, Spencer Greer, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production coordination by Catherine Ricardo. Analytics by Elisa Rosen. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.